I thought today we might make a video on how to terminate radio antenna bases. Now we've got 3 radio antenna bases here from 3 different manufacturers. 2 of them are terminated in a very similar fashion, and the third one is a little different. This one here is a Pacific base. This one's actually second hand. You can see there's a bit of I've chopped it off. I can't remember what reason I chopped it off now, but anyway, I've chopped it off. It's second hand, and it's made by Pacific. As you can see, it's got a nut on the lower side here, and the coax cable runs up the base from below, and it's soldered from above. We have a GME antenna base here, and the GME's a little bit different. It's got a nut arrangement on the top that holds the separate components together. It's actually a nut and O-ring actually. But the GME base disassembles. The centre piece comes out, and I'll have to go and get a crescent spanner to disconnect that to show that to you in a minute. I'll show that to you as we assemble this antenna. And the last base I have in my hand here is an RFI base. Its part number's MB10. It's almost a combination of the other 2 types. You have a nut and O-ring on here, which enables the antenna to be disassembled, and in the base we have the coax going up through the bottom there. Anyway, one by one we'll have a look at these, and we'll show you how they're correctly assembled. And I guess we should explain the reason why we're doing this. Coax cable has 2 parts to it. We've got a piece of coax cable here, and we'll just chop the end off, and we'll literally dissect the end here to have a look at it. It has a black outer jacket, as you can see, which is nothing more than a weatherproof covering, if you like. Underneath the black outer jacket we have a braid, which actually acts as a energy return, if you like, or a signal return. And we have the center conductor, which is inside the dielectric here. So there's a dielectric insulator. The dielectric is an insulator, sorry. And I'll just chop the dielectric back and expose the center. So the center conductor is, if you like, the energy feed, or if you're thinking about this in terms of DC, it would be positive, and if you're thinking about this in terms of AC terms, it would be phase. The return back from the aerial is coming back via the braid, which is this mesh arrangement round here, or some people call it the screen or the shield. If you're thinking about this in electrical terms, it would be the negative, or if you were talking about 230 volts for a supply type thing, it's the neutral. Now, it's going to be obvious to everyone that for an antenna to work correctly, you are going to have to correctly terminate both the center conductor and the braid into the antenna base. If the 2 separate parts of a coax cable, the braid and the center conductor, are not correctly terminated into this base, then obviously it's not going to work properly. So what we're going to do now is, one by one, we're going to terminate a scrap piece of coaxial cable into the 3 antenna bases that I've got here as examples, to give you an idea how it's done properly. Here's a new Pacific antenna base. It has a retaining nut on the bottom. It doesn't disassemble like the others. This upper piece doesn't come off. there is a sticky backed foam seal on the bottom, and you obviously you'll need to peel that back to expose the sticky surface before you apply it. Squeeze that back on there, and there's a nut on the bottom. Now I'll take the nut right off, and then the nut's the retaining nut. Take that right off, and we'll look closely at the bottom of this antenna, and you'll see up inside here there looks like an internal thread within that hole in the base. That's actually quite important. When we look at the top, we've got our thread that obviously the antenna is going to fasten to, and we're going to solder into this hole in the top. Now, the one recommendation I can make with all the antennas we'll be terminating is to score with something sharp where you're going to solder, so you've got a nice bright new piece of metal to solder to. This upper piece here is brass, and brass gets a little bit dulled, and once it's a little bit dulled it's quite difficult to solder to. So we're just going to score in here all the way around like this. Something that's just going to take the top surface of that dull brass away and give us something nice and new to solder to. Just put the base to one side and have a look at the end of the coax cable. Okay, let's try that again. I'll come up here about there. I'll just try that again. There we go. That's better. Nice neat strip. And back here we'll have cut just through the plastic jacket. There we go. And while we're talking about the qualities of coax cable and antenna bases, obviously if you're going to be doing this kind of work and you're going to solder, nice clean areas here to solder to are obviously a requirement, otherwise you'll find soldering very difficult. And the same applies to your coax cable. So if you're doing this in the field and the coax cable's been there for some time, you might find that you either have to replace it or cut back from the end and re-expose some fresh cable. Now, what we've got here is we've got this exposed braid. We're going to terminate the Pacific antenna, and we've got this internal thread that runs up the inside. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll this braid back over the top, backwards like that, over the top of the rain jacket part of the coax cable. We're then going to strip the end of the center part of the coax, the center conductor. We're going to peel back the dielectric, and this stuff's sometimes can be quite difficult to strip back. I'm just going to strip this back and do it in short pieces. We can try to, as much as possible, keep the center, all the strands of the center conductor intact. And we need to strip this back just enough so that we can solder it. I'm just lining these two up together like that to get an approximate length. I twist these loose strands together. And we're now going to feed this up through the base from below. Now if you're doing this and you're going to put this through a base or through a vehicle skin, I highly recommend you get the antenna nut and feed that down over the coax cable first, because it's quite difficult to get on there afterwards in some circumstances. Okay, so we've now got our coax braid folded back down here, and we're just going to present this over the end, and the cable will come right out the tip. Hopefully this is able to be seen. And then this here, this is the important piece, this base needs to be wound down over the top of this braid, so this braid is actually the internal thread within the on the inside of this bottom piece literally bites into this braid and gets a jolly good grip of it. So I'm just going to try and do this on camera so that everyone can see. Hold the coax cable and literally wind that down over there, and that's 50% of what's needed to happen when you terminate these, because obviously you need just like any other electrical fitting, you need a return. Okay, so that's wound tightly on there, and what we do here is I normally put a little pigtail in this, just twist it like that, trim any loose bits off the end like that, and we then solder that to the tip like that. I'm not going to do it here today because I'm trying to film this and demonstrate it all on camera. Having a hot soldering iron just going to add to the risk of me getting burnt fingers. Of course your solder is quite important here too. I use resin cord solder, 4060 solder, and I also use one of these Portasol gas soldering irons. Very useful because in the field, of course, there's 9 times out of 10 no source of electricity to run an electric soldering iron. The one difficulty with the gas soldering iron is when it's blowing a howling gale or it's raining, it's quite difficult to get the tip of the soldering iron. Well, it's quite difficult to get the soldering iron to run in the first place, but it's quite difficult to get the tip of the soldering iron up to sufficient temperature to solder this. I've actually I use the largest tip that I can get, because of course you need to transfer heat into the brass on the top of this base, and you need to do it relatively quickly, and you need a good soldering job. If you apply too much heat here, what will tend to happen is this piece will melt the base and the thing will fall out. So you need to solder this securely, neatly and relatively quickly. So you need a fairly hot soldering iron with a fairly large tip on it to do that job. Okay, this is a RFI antenna base. I believe the part number is called what's called an MB10 base. I'll pull it apart on camera. There's a nut on the top. Put that to one side. There's an O-ring washer round there. I'll just put that to one side as well. There's the upper cap section, that thing there, and then there's a large sealing washer, large soft waterproof sealing washer. Now this sealing washer is the one reason why these antennas are really good for if you've got an antenna base with a large flat soft rubber sealing washer like that. When you put it through a roof surface, if you're doing your job neatly and cleanly, and yeah, it'll seal up. I still recommend the use of sealant, but this is the thing that determines whether or not it's going to leak primarily. And then we've got the base of the antenna here. Now again, if we look carefully, we've got up inside the base where the coax cable is going to go, we've got a thread internally up inside here. So to terminate this antenna base, and this one, unlike the Pacific antenna which has a nut from below, this antenna base is presented from below and all of the other components assemble above. So what we need to do for this antenna is, again, we need to strip our coax cable and fold the braid over. So I'll just do that again, as the end of this cable is now looking a little bit ratty. I'll just strip that off of there and expose a bit more of the braid. Like that. We'll just roll this across like that and fold it down over the top of the black weather jacket like that. And this is going to be, in a very similar fashion to the Pacific antenna, is going to be fed up in the base and literally wound on. We need to strip again a little bit more here. I'm just holding the coax cable up against the base to give me an idea of how much I need to strip. And I'll strip a bit back down to about here. Again, try to preserve as much of these strands, if not all of them, that you can as part of that center conductor. I'll then thread this. Oops, I've forgotten something. Again, highly recommend doing this. Score the inside here of the tip of the antenna where you're going to solder. In this case, this is, I'm not sure what the plating is, it's probably zinc, but it's zinc plated over brass. And we'll just score that round inside there, because that's where we need to get a good solder joint. And then we're going to present the cable up from below, right up the centre, and we're going to grasp our coax at the base, and we're going to wind this down onto that braid, and the internal thread is going to get a jolly good grip of the braid, because after all, that's our electrical return. It's just as important as the center conductor. It's got to be well terminated. Then and again, I put a little pigtail here normally. I'll put a little pigtail in this and present it into the end, snip any surplus off like that, and we're going to apply a soldering iron to here, and we're going to solder onto the tip there, and that is a correctly terminated RFI MB10 base. When we use this base, we are going to have a roof surface or a metal skin surface, and it's going to be presented from below up through the skin like that, and then from above we're going to apply that rubber washer, and as I said before, that's the real reason why these things seal. And then we're going to reapply the cap, the O-ring washer, and the nut, just like that. And the nut and the O-ring washer and this cap pressing down on the rubber seal keeps the whole thing watertight, and then the antenna goes on from above that again. The last base I wish to show you today is a base supplied by GME, and we'll have a close look at this base before we start working with it. When we look at it and turn it upside down, we notice that there's no thread up here in the bottom, nothing whatsoever up in there. It has a nut on the top. I'll just undo this. And an O-ring. Then the plastic cap. And again, a nice big, flat, soft rubber washer. The real reason why these things are waterproof. And when we look at the remainder of the antenna, we discover that there's some flats on the upper part of this threaded section here. And if you grasp the lower part of the antenna and the upper part of the antenna, you can unscrew this. Hey presto, we've now got two separate components. We've got a threaded section with a nylon base on it, and we've got a base here. Now to terminate this antenna, the first thing you need to do is slip this base over the top of the end of your coax cable. And I'll chop the end of the coax cable off. There we go. It always makes things easier if you've got a nice clean end to work with. And we're going to slide this base over the end of there. What we're going to do now is we're going to strip this coax cable back approximately the same length as this upper piece, maybe slightly more. We'll use the upper piece as a guide and maybe go 10 millimeters or so more. Pull the end off like that. Now this piece at the bottom, where I was stripping and exposing the braid, and my stripping tool's only exposing about 8 millimeters of this braid. What we do with this antenna is we expose about 15 millimeters of it, like this. Like that. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're just going to slide our fingers down this portion, which is the dielectric insulator over the center conductor, and we're just going to push that down so that it forms a donut, like that. Hopefully you can see this in the camera. Just forms a nice neat donut, just like that. Little bulge. We haven't unwoven the braid at all, haven't done anything like that at all, we've just pushed it down nice and neatly. Now if you wish to, with this antenna, one of the things that I've done, which I think is a good idea, particularly if the water's likely to get to it, is just put a little knob of sealant just underneath this braid portion, because what's going to happen is that's now going to go down inside this base like that and sit down inside, down in there, and it's going to stop the cable from moving any further down. We're going to now strip our center conductor, so that, bearing in mind this is the piece that's going to wind down, and in fact I'll wind it down here just to show you. It goes down on top like that, and it's going to thread down there like that, and it's going to compress that little donut of braid inside the base down in here. But we need to actually do two things before we do that. We need to strip this dielectric insulator off the center conductor, and we also need to score the inner part of this brass piece at the top here. So let's just do that. I'll strip this as several sections. Again, you want to retain as many of the strands of the center conductor as you possibly can. I might go one more. and give it a twist. Keep all those loose fine strands together. And present this donut of braid down inside the base again, and we're going to score the inside of this piece here. Highly recommend you do that. It gives you something nice and clean to solder onto. Then we're going to present this up the inside like that, all the way down there like that, and we're going to screw that in there like that. Now I normally grasp this bottom section with a pair of pliers or with an 8-inch crescent, and the flats either side of this threaded section at the top here, I'll grasp that with a 6-inch crescent and tighten that up so that the donut of braid down in the base here is compressed firmly in there. And then we get this upper section, give it a pigtail twirl like that, and snip that off. And then we use our soldering iron and solder, and we're going to solder that onto there, into there, nice and neatly. Again, this antenna, when it's correctly assembled like this, and we need a good connection on the braid as well as on the center conductor, because this is the, if you like, this is the source and the braid is the return. We're going to present this through the panel material. We're going to mount it through from below. The large rubber sealing washer goes on the top, the hat goes above that, the O-ring goes above that, and the nut on the top secures the whole thing. And that's a correctly terminated GME base.